Way back in 1489, the brand new Tudor dynasty was just getting on its feet when a tax protest up in the north of England just spun completely out of control. And we're not talking about a small riot here. We're talking about a full-blown rebellion that ended with the murder of one of the most powerful men in the entire kingdom. Okay, let's get into it and figure out how a simple dispute over money turned into a massive crisis for a new king.
So this is the big question, right? What on earth could drive ordinary people, farmers, townspeople, to kill the king's own representative in cold blood? Was it just pure desperation? Or was something else going on? Something a little more political, maybe even sinister? To figure that out, we have to go right to the scene of the crime.
So picture this. It's April 28th, 1489. We're near a town called Thirsk in North Yorkshire. And there's this incredibly tense standoff about to happen between a furious mob and a powerful nobleman who's been sent to lay down the law.
Now what jumps out right away is who the victim was. Henry Percy wasn't just some tax collector. He was the Earl of Northumberland, the king's main guy in the north. His job was to tell the people, you have to pay this tax, no more arguments. The response? It was violent and it was fast. But here's the most shocking part. His own men, the guys who were paid to protect him, supposedly just stood back and let the mob get him. And get this, he was the only person killed that day. That tells you this was personal. This was a targeted hit.
And this quote from a chronicler at the time, Pollard or Virgil, just nails it. It shows us the mindset of the rebels. This wasn't just random violence. To the people of Yorkshire, Percy wasn't just some messenger boy. No, he was the face of their suffering. He was the author of the injury that they just couldn't take anymore.
Okay, so to really understand why people were pushed to this point, we need to zoom out from that crime scene and take a look at the huge financial mess the new king, Henry VII, had found himself in.
You know, Henry Tudor wins this epic battle, the Battle of Bosworth Field, and ends decades of civil war. But what does he inherit? A government that is, for all intents and purposes, completely broke. If he wanted to solidify his power and keep his rivals at bay, he needed cash, and he needed it yesterday.
And this brings us to this key idea of extraordinary income. Think of it this way. This wasn't the money for paying the bills. This was the emergency fund, the big money a king needed for something huge, like a foreign war, which, in this case, was a campaign to defend a place called Brittany from France. And the only way to get that kind of money was to go to Parliament and ask for it.
So here's the crucial detail. Henry didn't just ask for any old tax. The old system, called tenths and fifteenths, was something people were used to. It was a fixed amount that a whole town or village would pay together. But Henry rolls out this new subsidy, and it was a direct tax on your personal wealth, your income. And to make things worse, this was piled on top of two other taxes people were already struggling to pay. It felt incredibly invasive, like a total break with tradition.
So Henry's government had this really ambitious target for their new tax. £75,000, a massive amount of money for the time. So after all that trouble, after pushing everyone to their limit, how much did they actually bring in? Just £27,000.
Yeah, that number tells you everything you need to know. It's a story of total catastrophic failure. This shows it wasn't just a few people complaining. This was a massive countrywide resistance against a burden that people either couldn't pay or at this point, just plain wouldn't.
Right, but if the whole country was unhappy, why did things explode into murder, specifically in Yorkshire? Well, to get that, we have to look at the very unique set of pressures that region was under. It was a real tinderbox.
Yorkshire was basically facing a perfect storm. First off, they had this long-standing tradition of being let off the hook for war taxes because, hey, they were busy defending the Scottish border. Henry VII just ignored that. Then, add a nasty regional recession into the mix. Oh, and the harvest the year before? A total failure. And it got even worse in specific areas. The rebellion actually kicked off in a place called Cleveland, where a lack of grain meant the price of oats, a food staple, had gone through the roof. This tax didn't just feel unfair. For many, it felt like a death sentence.
And look, this isn't just us guessing. Historians like Andy Wood have laid it all out. Issues like this, the fairness of taxes, the basic cost of survival, these were the absolute bedrock of what we'd call popular politics back then. It wasn't about abstract ideas. It was about whether you could feed your family.
So, we have a very clear motive rooted in economics and desperation. But was that the whole story? This brings us to a huge debate among historians. Was this really just a grassroots uprising born out of poverty? Or was that desperation being used for some other, deeper political game?
Let's break down these two theories.
On one side, you've got the socio-economic view. This argues that, at its heart, this was all about poverty and an unfair tax. The evidence is strong, right? The bad harvest, the broken traditions, the intrusive tax itself. But then, there's the dynastic view. This theory points to one of the rebel leaders, a guy named Sir John Egremont. He was a known supporter of the old House of York, the rivals to the Tudors. And where does he run off to when the rebellion fails? To the court of Margaret of Burgundy, basically the headquarters for anyone trying to overthrow the king. From this angle, the tax wasn't the cause, it was the excuse, a perfect way to stir up trouble and weaken the new Tudor dynasty.
So, how did this all end? Well, murdering an earl turns a protest into an act of high treason pretty fast. Let's look at what happened next, and maybe more importantly, how King Henry handled this massive challenge to his authority.
Things escalated so quickly. After Percy was killed, the rebels, now led by Sir John Egremont, actually marched on and captured the city of York. I mean, that's a huge blow to the king's authority. But Henry's response was just as fast. He sent a massive army north, led by the Earl of Surrey, and within 5 days, York was back in royal hands and the rebellion was pretty much crushed.
And Henry's response here is just a masterclass in Tudor politics. First, an overwhelming show of force, an army of about 10,000 men. Message sent, I'm in charge. Second, targeted justice. He executes one of the leaders, Robert Chambers, to make an example of him. But then, and this is the genius part, he shows mercy. He pardons over 1,500 rebels and, crucially, cancels the rest of the tax for Yorkshire. He knew you couldn't rule by fear alone. Finally, he tightens his grip by putting one of his own loyal men, a Southerner, in charge of the North.
So, a failed tax, a murdered earl, a crushed rebellion. Why are we still talking about this over 500 years later? Well, because this one event tells us so much about power, about politics, and about just how fragile that early Tudor government really was.
At the end of the day, the Yorkshire Rebellion was so much more than a local problem. It was one of the first huge tests of Henry VII's entire reign. It forced him to prove he could actually control his own kingdom, and it shaped that classic Tudor method of ruling, that careful mix of brute force and clever compromise for the next 100 years.
So what are the big takeaways from all this? First, it shows that even a king's power has limits. You can't just do whatever you want. Second, it proves that real-world economic pain is an incredibly powerful driver of political action. Third, this is where the Tudors really wrote their playbook on how to handle dissent. And finally, it just highlights this massive disconnect between the government in London and the people out in the regions, who felt like their lives and traditions were being completely ignored.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? We tend to think of history as being all about kings and queens and big battles for the throne, but the Yorkshire Rebellion is a powerful reminder that history is also driven by the everyday, gut-level struggles of ordinary people. So, what really moves the needle of history? The grand plans of kings, or the simple, desperate fight over the price of bread?